The cold, damp air of northern France carried a metallic taste, the kind of taste that clung to the lungs and promised death in its quiet, insidious way. Smoke from burning villages mixed with the acrid scent of spent shells, and across the fields, the echo of rumbling engines and grinding tracks rolled like an ominous drumbeat. It was late 1944, and every American tanker knew the name that could chill their blood faster than any whispered rumor: Panther. The Panther was supposed to be untouchable, a mechanized predator that could annihilate a Sherman from hundreds of yards away. Its long 75mm gun sliced through Allied armor with frightening precision. Its thick, sloped plates turned bullets into sparks of impotent defiance, and its German crews, confident and disciplined, moved with lethal grace across the battlefield. To the men inside the M4 Shermans, the Panther was more than a machine. It was the embodiment of inevitability. Facing one felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, while the world held its breath. Then reports began to surface that no one could initially believe. In hushed voices over static-filled radio channels and in muddy command posts, tank crews spoke of miracles. A 76mm Sherman had destroyed a Panther from the front. The idea was absurd, almost heretical. How could a medium tank with a gun, long considered inadequate, take down Germany's pride in armored engineering? Many dismissed the stories as wishful thinking, morale-boosting propaganda meant to lift spirits in a war that seemed endless and indifferent. But the reports kept coming, stubbornly persistent, painting a picture that refused to fit the accepted rules of engagement. Panthers were dying to Shermans, and the men at the front were beginning to whisper a new name with cautious reverence: HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, a weapon that seemed to bend the laws of physics to the will of men desperate to survive. The first time a Sherman gunner felt the difference, it was a revelation. Inside the barrel of the 76mm lay a slim, unassuming projectile with a tungsten core that could slice through steel as though it were paper. The moment it left the muzzle, it screamed forward at unimaginable speed, faster than any shell the tank crews had ever fired. When it struck, the Panther shuddered and caught fire, its turret shattering in a blinding flash of metal and flame. For the American crew, it was more than victory. It was a shock, a promise that the impossible could become reality. The battlefield had shifted in an instant, though the German commanders had no idea their machines, once considered invincible, were suddenly vulnerable to a tank they had long dismissed as inferior. This story was never just about ammunition. It was about survival, innovation, and the relentless tension of war. Each duel between Sherman and Panther was a clash of wills as much as of metal, a dance choreographed by desperation and ingenuity. The HVAP round was born not in the heat of battle, but in quiet, fluorescent-lit laboratories and testing ranges far from the front. Engineers, constrained by material shortages and pressed by the urgency of war, experimented with speed, density, and geometry. They had no choice to build bigger guns. The Sherman could not carry them. Instead, they created something subtler, something that relied not on brute force, but on precision, velocity, and the immutable laws of physics. The first tests were clandestine, watched only by a handful of men who could imagine the revolution hiding in a thin, dense projectile. When the shell pierced steel plates that had once been thought impervious, the quiet laboratories erupted into restrained celebration. Here was proof that ingenuity could level the battlefield. In the forests and fields of Europe, though, no one yet understood what was coming. Sherman crews still crouched behind hedgerows, peering through periscopes at looming Panther silhouettes, hearts hammering against the fear that their armor could not withstand a single shot. They had been told the gun was too weak, the armor too thin, the enemy too cunning. Then came the moment that would mark a turning point. A Sherman lay hidden behind a French crossroads near Dompierre, the crew tense, ears straining to catch the slightest sound of approaching tracks. A Panther appeared, rolling confidently into view as if predestined to kill. The gunner fired a single round. The projectile tore across the open field with a hiss of inevitability, striking the Panther dead center. The engine deck exploded in flame, the turret twisting in a final futile gesture of defiance. The crew scrambled, smoke and fire consuming them in a moment of chaos. The Sherman crew sat stunned, the impossible accomplished. They had just witnessed a miracle of science and daring. A tiny slug of tungsten rewriting the rules of engagement. This was the quiet birth of a revolution that neither the Germans nor the battlefield could anticipate. The HVAP round would not make the Sherman invincible, and it would not end the war. But it demonstrated a simple, brutal truth, that cleverness, courage, and the meticulous application of physics could momentarily tip the scales, that underdog machines could strike back at the giants of steel with a single, lightning-fast projectile. In that instant, the balance of armored warfare shifted, not through overwhelming force, but through speed, precision, and the relentless logic of invention. And yet, behind every successful strike lay a hidden cost: scarcity of tungsten, the need for careful aiming, the constant risk that a Panther might fire first. Victory was possible, but never guaranteed. This delicate tension, this razor's edge between life and death, between old assumptions and new reality, is where our story begins, in the smoke and mud of late 1944 Europe, where a single, unassuming shell began to change the fate of men, machines, and the very nature of armored combat. By the summer of 1944, the battlefields of Europe were a chaotic tapestry of mud, steel, and fire. The Allies had landed in Normandy, their boots sinking into fields scarred by hedgerows and barbed wire, while the Germans scrambled to contain the invasion with what they had left. Across France, the roar of engines and the whistle of artillery became a constant, terrifying rhythm, and everywhere American crews faced the same brutal realization. Their Shermans were good, but they were not enough. Against German Panthers and Tigers, the Sherman's armor often felt paper-thin, and its gun, once considered adequate, ricocheted uselessly off the sloped steel of the enemy. Time and again, engagements ended in frustration, with crews narrowly escaping death or witnessing their comrades burn alive in tanks that could not withstand a single well-placed shot. The problem was not just the Panther itself, though its technological superiority was undeniable. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun, combined with thick, sloped armor, made it a nightmare for any medium tank, and German crews had been trained to exploit every advantage, from terrain to timing, to maximize the Panther's lethality. Against such opponents, the standard American tactics, massed frontal assaults, aggressive flanking, reliance on numerical superiority, often ended in disaster. Pilots of the skies and tankers on the ground alike felt the creeping realization that the rules had changed. What had worked against Panzer IIIs and IVs no longer applied. American ingenuity was being tested under fire, and the calculus of survival demanded adaptation, not bravado. Amid the mud and smoke, a different kind of battlefield existed far from the front lines, in laboratories, testing grounds, and arsenals across the United States. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground, chemists at Watervliet Arsenal, and ordnance specialists in every corner of the country wrestled with a single question: how to give the Sherman a fighting chance against superior armor. They could not simply build a bigger tank. The Sherman's design and mass production requirements were fixed. They could not rely solely on quantity, even though the U.S. could churn out thousands of Shermans every month. The solution lay in physics, in the properties of metals, in the understanding that speed could overcome thickness. If the gun could not grow, the projectile could. Tungsten, scarce but extraordinarily dense, offered a path. Encased in a precisely engineered shell, it could pierce armor at velocities that had previously seemed unattainable. It was a subtle, almost surgical answer to a brutal, blunt problem: how to kill what had been unkillable. The men and women behind the HVAP program understood the stakes. Every experiment, every test, every calculation had consequences hundreds of miles away in the forests, towns, and roads where Sherman and Panther crews would face each other in deadly dance. This was not just innovation for its own sake. This was life and death distilled into engineering. And yet, the road to practical deployment was riddled with obstacles. Tungsten was rare, its mining and refinement a global challenge during wartime. Ammunition production lines were already stretched to the limit, and the engineers had to convince skeptical commanders that their small, slender shells could achieve what heavier, conventional rounds could not. Many dismissed the tests as academic exercises with no real application in the chaos of combat, unaware that this unassuming projectile could redefine armored warfare. Back on the front lines, the mismatch between American and German armor was starkly visible. Shermans, agile but lightly armored, were being forced into engagements where every mistake could be fatal. Panther crews moved with disciplined precision, exploiting terrain and timing to dominate fields where numbers and courage alone could not prevail. American commanders, faced with mounting losses, demanded innovation. Some solutions were straightforward, like coordinating artillery and air support, but those could not always reach the tanks under fire in the dense woods of Lorraine or the hedgerows of Normandy. The Sherman needed a tool that could reliably threaten even the heaviest German tanks at the range and speed required to survive. It was a puzzle that stretched from the command posts of Europe to the proving grounds of Maryland, linking the muddy battlefield to the clean, sterile halls of military science. Amid this tension, a few figures emerged as pivotal: engineers like Charles W. Wood and ordnance officers who understood the delicate balance between projectile velocity, armor thickness, and tactical deployment. On the battlefield, tankers such as crews of the 4th and 7th Armored Divisions faced the starkest consequences of failed tactics, learning painfully that bravery alone could not compensate for underpowered guns. The convergence of these worlds, the men under fire and the minds behind the HVAP project, would define the next phase of the war. The American medium tank, once outmatched, was on the verge of acquiring a hidden edge, one that could turn the tide in unexpected, dramatic ways. It was in this crucible of necessity that the HVAP round emerged, a small but potent answer to a massive, deadly problem. The story was no longer just about tanks or ammunition. It was about the collision of ingenuity, desperation, and the relentless logic of survival in war. The Sherman, long underestimated, was about to step onto the battlefield with a secret that the Germans never anticipated. And yet, even with this new weapon, every engagement remained perilous, every shot a gamble, and the question loomed. Could this slender, high-velocity slug truly alter the balance against machines designed to crush it? By the autumn of 1944, the Americans had learned a bitter truth. Courage alone was no shield against the Panther. Reports of failed assaults, shattered Shermans, and crews burned alive were piling up on command desks, each one a stark reminder of vulnerability. In the dense forests of Lorraine, under the gray, oppressive skies, entire platoons found themselves trapped by the precise fire of German tank crews who seemed to anticipate every move. One patrol, advancing toward a small crossroads, saw 3 Panthers emerge from the mist. The Shermans opened fire in unison, their 75mm rounds bouncing off the sloped frontal armor like sparks against stone. Within minutes, 2 American tanks were ablaze, their crews scrambling to escape the inferno. The remaining Shermans pulled back, battered, exhausted, and haunted by the efficiency of a machine that seemed almost invincible. These failures were more than tactical disappointments. They were psychological blows. Tank commanders and gunners began to doubt the tools they had relied upon for years. Confidence eroded in quiet moments behind the lines, whispered in tents and command posts. Veterans muttered about walking into traps, about the futility of charging armored columns without heavy guns or miracle rounds. Standard tactics, coordinated flanking maneuvers, massed frontal assaults, reliance on artillery spotting, repeatedly fell short. The terrain itself seemed to favor the enemy, hedgerows, forests, and narrow roads, turning the Sherman's agility into a liability, leaving it exposed to the lethal accuracy of the Panther's long gun. One particularly devastating encounter occurred near the village of Dompierre, where an American armored task force moved to intercept a German counterattack. Visibility was low, the roads churned into mud by recent rains, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and diesel. A Panther crew, lying in wait behind a slight rise, opened fire with surgical precision. The first shot tore through the frontal armor of a Sherman, igniting fuel and ammunition in a fiery inferno. Another round struck a second tank, its turret violently blown off. By the time reinforcements arrived, the engagement had already ended in catastrophe. The American commanders in the field sent frantic reports back to headquarters, describing the encounter as a disaster beyond expectation. The men who survived returned to their bases silent, haunted, aware that their weapons, their training, and their courage had been inadequate against this mechanized terror. It was clear that something had to change. Engineers and ordnance officers in the United States, poring over reports of these failures, realized that the 76mm gun, even when upgraded from the older 75mm, had limits that could no longer be ignored. It could defeat medium German tanks like Panzer IVs with relative ease, but the Panther and Tiger remained largely immune to conventional rounds. The problem was not only armor, it was velocity. The shells lacked the speed and mass to penetrate the sophisticated metallurgy of German designs. American crews, facing the relentless efficiency of the enemy, were losing confidence, morale, and, tragically, comrades. Every engagement underscored the urgency for innovation. As the crisis deepened, individual ingenuity began to emerge. Pilots and tankers experimented with tactics on their own, attempting to exploit weak spots, aiming for tracks, side armor, or exposed hatches. These improvisations sometimes worked, but too often at great cost. Commanders saw the need for a systematic solution, a technological breakthrough rather than ad hoc heroics. The battlefield was teaching a harsh lesson. Conventional thinking would no longer suffice. The margin for error was shrinking, and the Panther seemed to embody an unassailable wall of steel that no Sherman had yet been able to breach. In this crucible of failure, the Americans were forced to confront a stark truth. Without something radically new, they would continue to bleed men and machines. The reports of burnt tanks and decimated crews were a constant reminder that victory required not just courage or numbers, but invention. The HVAP program, still in its infancy, represented a fragile hope, a possibility that physics, chemistry, and careful engineering could achieve what brute force could not. Behind the front lines, engineers, metallurgists, and ordnance officers pored over formulas, tested prototypes, and debated strategies with a sense of urgency that mirrored the desperation of the men facing death in Europe's fields and forests. The Sherman was reaching the limits of what it could do with conventional ammunition, and the Panther remained a nightmare made of metal and precision. A breakthrough was no longer optional, it was essential. Amid this pressure, the tension was palpable. Every mission that ended in failure reinforced the need for change, and every survival was a fleeting reminder of what could be accomplished with even the slightest advantage. The stage was set for innovation to collide with necessity, for a quiet revolution in ammunition and tactics that would finally give the Sherman a chance against the Panther. It was in this moment of crisis, when desperation and ingenuity intersected, that the HVAP round would move from the laboratory into the crucible of combat, altering not only the fate of individual crews, but the very course of armored warfare. The turning point arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, far from the roar of battle. In a warehouse filled with the sharp tang of oil and the faint hum of machinery, American ordnance officers carefully loaded the first batches of HVAP rounds into crates. Each shell, slender and deceptively unassuming, carried within it a dense core of tungsten, the product of painstaking science and scarce resources. It was more than ammunition. It was hope engineered into metal. Soldiers handling the rounds felt a strange mix of reverence and anxiety, aware that this tiny innovation might be the only thing standing between them and annihilation. On the battlefield, crews of the 4th and 7th Armored Divisions had been briefed on the new technology, though few fully understood its potential. The first combat deployment was unremarkable in appearance, a Sherman rolling into the forests of Lorraine, its crew tense and alert, engines growling in low gear. The Panthers they had learned to fear moved like shadows among the trees, confident, methodical, untouchable. The gunner adjusted the periscope, checking distance and angle, while the loader primed the HVAP shell with hands that shook not from fear, but from the weight of possibility. When the command came, the gunner fired. The moment the tungsten projectile left the barrel, it seemed to carry a promise. The shell cut through the cold morning air with a high-pitched hiss, faster and truer than anything the crew had ever fired. It struck the Panther's frontal armor almost impossibly, penetrating where conventional rounds had bounced off like sparks. The impact detonated fuel and ammunition within, and the turret twisted violently before collapsing in a cascade of steel and flame. For a heartbeat, silence hung over the forest. Then the crew realized what they had witnessed. A Sherman, equipped with a round no larger than a pencil in appearance, had accomplished what logic and previous experience had deemed impossible. Word of the first successful use of HVAP rounds spread quickly among tank crews. The effect was immediate, almost intoxicating. Commanders, initially skeptical, now saw tangible proof that American ingenuity could counter German superiority. The new tactic was not simply to fire more shells or to charge harder, but to apply precision, timing, and the unparalleled velocity of the HVAP round to exploit weaknesses that had previously seemed unreachable. Crews began coordinating engagements differently, focusing on calculated shots rather than sheer volume, moving with caution but armed with a newfound confidence. For the first time, the Sherman could face a Panther and have a real chance of survival, not through luck, but through science and strategy. The Germans, however, did not immediately recognize the threat. To their eyes, the Shermans were the same medium tanks they had long underestimated. Reports of Panthers destroyed by seemingly weak guns were initially dismissed as anomalies, errors in communication, or rare flukes. It was only after multiple engagements, each more damning than the last, that the truth became undeniable. The HVAP round, compact and unassuming, had rewritten the rules of armored combat. The battlefield became a testing ground, and every encounter taught both sides something new. The Americans learned how to maximize the effect of the round, while the Germans scrambled to adapt their tactics, increasingly wary of the once unthreatening Shermans. This breakthrough was not without its limits. Tungsten was scarce, production could not meet the sudden demand, and every HVAP round had to be used with care. Crews learned to prioritize targets, reserve precious ammunition for critical moments, and maintain discipline under fire. Each engagement became a test not only of skill, but of judgment. The first successful deployment of HVAP rounds was not a panacea. It was a beginning. It marked the moment when desperation, innovation, and courage converged to alter the trajectory of armored warfare, giving the Americans a tool to level the playing field against an enemy they had once thought invincible. In the forests, villages, and crossroads of Europe, the new tactic began to ripple outward. Shermans struck Panthers with deadly precision. Crews survived encounters that would have been fatal weeks earlier, and a fragile, hard-won confidence began to return to American armored units. The breakthrough was both technical and psychological, a reminder that even in the midst of chaos, human ingenuity could find a way. The HVAP round transformed the Sherman from a symbol of vulnerability into an instrument capable of rewriting the rules of engagement. It was a quiet revolution, wrought not with overwhelming force but with velocity, precision, and relentless ingenuity, and it would soon leave an indelible mark on the final chapters of the war. The forests of Lorraine and the fields of the Ardennes became a stage for a quiet but transformative revolution. With the introduction of HVAP rounds, the Sherman tank was no longer a fragile medium armor waiting to be shredded by German fire. It had become a threat, precise, swift, and lethal. Crews who had spent months cowering behind hedgerows now moved with a sense of cautious empowerment, knowing that the once dreaded Panther could finally be challenged on their terms. The first victories were almost surreal. A single Sherman gunner, calculating distance and velocity with meticulous care, could strike the frontal armor of a Panther and watch it erupt in flame, its turret torn away as if it were paper. These moments were brief, violent, and decisive, and yet they carried a weight far beyond the physical destruction. Each successful engagement reinforced the idea that American ingenuity could match, and in moments surpass, German technological supremacy. The consequences rippled quickly across the front lines. Commanders began to reimagine tactics, using the HVAP rounds not as a novelty, but as a strategic advantage. Ambushes were planned to maximize the shell's velocity and penetration, targeting the most formidable threats first. Shermans moved in tighter coordination, supported by artillery and air reconnaissance, their crews emboldened by the knowledge that a single shot could neutralize a previously untouchable enemy. In battles near Dompierre and the Ardennes, reports detailed Panther losses at unprecedented rates. Entire German units, once feared invincible, found themselves under siege from a force they had underestimated. The balance of armored warfare was shifting subtly but undeniably, and the psychological impact on both sides was profound. Yet the revolution was imperfect. HVAP rounds were a precious resource. Tungsten was scarce, rationed carefully, and every shot had to count. Crews learned the hard way that a missed opportunity could be fatal. A Sherman firing HVAP indiscriminately risked depleting its supply before the critical engagement, leaving itself vulnerable once more to the Panther's relentless fire. Commanders faced the difficult task of balancing aggression with restraint, teaching crews to fire only when conditions were optimal, to calculate angles, distances, and trajectories with painstaking precision. Mistakes, even minor ones, could undo the technological advantage and result in casualties that weighed heavily on morale. The lessons of early deployment were brutal. Brilliance was only effective when married to discipline. The Germans, meanwhile, were forced into a reactive posture. The sudden emergence of an American medium tank capable of destroying Panthers from the front shook the confidence of even the most seasoned commanders. Tactical adaptations followed, increased use of camouflage, alternating firing positions, and attempts to lure Shermans into disadvantageous terrain. Yet these measures could not fully negate the velocity and precision of the HVAP round. American crews, now learning to exploit the element of surprise and the new ammunition's capabilities, continued to inflict losses disproportionate to their numbers. The battlefield became a delicate chessboard where ingenuity, timing, and technology intersected, and every decision could tilt the outcome in unexpected ways. The emotional impact on crews cannot be overstated. The sense of vulnerability that had haunted Sherman crews for months began to shift into cautious confidence. Soldiers who had once accepted that facing a Panther might be a death sentence now approached engagements with a blend of fear and calculated hope. The victories were never easy, never guaranteed, and always expensive in mental and emotional terms. But they represented a turning point. For the first time, the idea that skill, science, and innovation could compensate for previous deficiencies became tangible in the mud, smoke, and fire of Europe's battlefields. The HVAP round, small and slender yet deadly, reshaped not only tactics, but the very psychology of armored warfare. It proved that technology, when combined with courage and precise application, could invert expectations, turning perceived weaknesses into strengths. The Sherman's newfound effectiveness forced German commanders to rethink their assumptions and their strategies, while American crews learned the value of discipline, calculation, and the quiet power of innovation. Every successful engagement with HVAP ammunition became a lesson etched into memory, a reminder that the war's outcome depended not solely on numbers or armor, but on the relentless creativity and bravery of those who dared to challenge the impossible. The war in Europe would not be decided by a single shell, nor by one tank, nor even by a single ingenious idea. Yet, in the quiet corridors of history, the HVAP round stands as a testament to what human ingenuity, urgency, and courage can achieve in the crucible of conflict. What began as a fragile experiment in laboratories and arsenals across the United States became a force that altered expectations, reshaped tactics, and offered a fleeting but vital edge to those who wielded it. The Shermans, once derided as underpowered and vulnerable, became vessels of possibility, proving that innovation could transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. The men who first loaded, fired, and calculated with HVAP rounds often went unheralded, their bravery hidden in reports and after-action summaries. Engineers, ordnance officers, and factory workers who had never seen a battlefield played roles as crucial as the soldiers who faced the Panthers in the forests of Europe. Together they formed an unbroken chain, linking imagination to action, theory to survival. Each successful strike was a culmination of countless decisions, precise measurements, and the willingness to challenge assumptions that had long gone untested. Their legacy was not only in the destroyed tanks and lives saved, but in the affirmation that intelligence and courage could find ways to balance scales seemingly tipped by superior firepower. Yet the story of the HVAP round also carries a sobering lesson. Advantage was fleeting, ammunition was scarce, the margin for error narrow, and every engagement still demanded life or death precision. The cost of innovation in war is never abstract. It is counted in moments of fear, flashes of fire, and lives forever altered. For every Panther felled by a high-velocity slug, countless soldiers had already paid the price of past mistakes, reminding us that even brilliance cannot erase the brutality of combat. The war did not pause to admire ingenuity. It punished hesitation, rewarded skill, and demanded relentless adaptation. In the broader sweep of history, the HVAP story resonates far beyond the fields of France or the factories of the United States. It echoes through lessons in engineering, tactics, and human resolve. It underscores the idea that even in situations where odds appear insurmountable, innovation can tilt the balance, even if only temporarily. The courage to experiment, to challenge convention, and to risk failure became as important as any gun or shell. In that sense, the HVAP round was not merely a weapon. It was a symbol of the human capacity to confront adversity with intellect, determination, and audacity. As the smoke cleared over Europe and the last tanks rumbled through devastated towns, the story of the HVAP round lingered in the minds of those who understood its significance. It was a reminder that in war, as in life, the smallest change can produce consequences far beyond its size. The tungsten core shell, no larger than a finger, had punched holes not only in Panther armor, but in the assumptions of an entire battlefield, proving that careful calculation, bold experimentation, and unflinching courage could achieve what once seemed impossible. And in that lesson, the story finds its quiet, ringing truth. The greatest victories are often born in the mind first, shaped by daring and insight, and then carried into the world, one courageous act at a time. In the end, it was not merely a question of firepower or armor. It was about the human will to confront impossibility, to reimagine the rules, and to insist, in the face of fear and doubt, that even the underdog could strike back. The HVAP round left its mark on history, not as a miracle of destruction, but as a testament to the ingenuity, bravery, and relentless spirit that defines those who dare to defy expectations. In the quiet aftermath, as the world moved forward from war to peace, that spirit remained. A reminder that courage and innovation, no matter how small in scale, can echo across history with profound resonance.